Harrisonburg native. He's here with Kim, his wife, tonight, and they do have some books with them, which is nice to know. Karl was a journalist and graduated from VCU, and he's had a career as a reporter and an editor of many different publications in the state, but he retired in 2021 from the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond, and they still live in the Richmond area. So, Karl?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to the Historic Society here for inviting me. Hank, if it's okay, I'm going to take this mic out of the little stand. It's just a little low. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. I love to talk about Peggy's War. It's been out for 7 months, and it took me 2.5 years to write it. Most of that was research. It is technically historical fiction. However, the 2.5 years that I spent researching it were to make it as factually accurate as I could in terms of being true to all the historical facts, and then connecting those facts with some literary devices that hopefully make it a little easier to read and to appreciate. This is my great-great-grandmother, Peggy Rhodes. Her real name is Margaret, but people called her Peggy because her grandmother was Margaret and her mother was Margaret. So Peggy it was, although people still called her by both names. But if you're looking at the historical record, look for Margaret. You probably won't find Peggy. And Peggy's early years really don't give us any indication of what she would do later. She had a very typical childhood as far as we can tell. She was born on March 19th, 1830, so today is Peggy's birthday. And she is 194 years old, if my math is correct. So is that, yeah, I think so. Okay, 194 years old. The background on this slide, by the way, is taken from the house where she grew up. She was not born in this house, but this house was recently renovated, and you can see the hand-hewn logs that have been refinished. She was actually born in Mount Crawford, which was about 6 miles south of Harrisonburg, and they moved a couple of years later into this house. So it's the only house that she would have ever known growing up. She was the daughter of Abraham Heatwole and Margaret Showalter, both very Valley, very Mennonite names. And she was the granddaughter of David Heatwole. Some of you that are really into genealogy will probably know that David Heatwole was the Heatwole that the Heatwole history starts with here in the Valley. So David and his wife was Magdalene Whalen. And of course, John Whalen was descended from Magdalene and wrote the history of Shenandoah County. If you ever go to the Heritage Center, the Brethren and Mennonite Heritage Center, just west of Harrisonburg, you will see a little cobbler's shop that's been recreated there. It uses the original foundation and some of the original materials, and that shop would have belonged to her grandfather, David Heatwole. So you can see Peggy's grandfather's house and you can see Peggy's parents' house, but unfortunately you can't see Peggy's house. She was the youngest of 4 children. She had a much older sister and 2 older brothers in between. They were educated fairly well for antebellum times. She would have learned both German and English. She was literate, so she could read and write in both. She lived in a period of transition for the Mennonites from German to English. So she would have, by the end of her life, I think the German would have been fading. Her children really didn't speak German. So I think she would have mostly spoken English at the time of the Civil War. And she lived at a place called Dale Enterprise. And we do have a map. I love maps. My wife teases me that I really, really do like maps. The red dot at the top of this map is where Peggy grew up. And then we have a little yellow arrow that points down to the place where Peggy moved when she got married. So she got married when she was 19. She married Henry Rhodes. And so the Rhodes beside the red dot there on the map is my great-great-grandfather. And that is the location of Peggy's depot on the Underground Railroad. So she only moved about 1 mile. People didn't move around as much in those days. So it's less than 1 mile, and her parents, brothers, sister all lived right around her. It was a very tight-knit community. And taking you down to ground level now, this is Peggy's farm. Peggy and Henry lived there, and the yellow arrow on this photo shows where Peggy's house would have been. We know almost exactly where it was. There's nothing there now. And the barn, the larger barn there, the red barn, is on the original foundation, we think. So that would go back well before the Civil War. This was the farm that Henry's parents owned. So when they moved there, Henry and Peggy would have lived probably in the little tenant house. And Henry's parents would have lived in the main house. So Peggy doesn't waste too much time starting a family. The clock that you see in this slide is the only artifact that I could find that was actually in Peggy and Henry's house. And I was intrigued by this because it chimes. It makes a sound. And this would be, in theory, the same sound that they would have heard at the time of the Civil War. And I wanted to hear, something that they would have heard. And I was a little disappointed because this is a very large clock. This is 7 feet tall. And it has been restored. It's not quite all original. But I was expecting this big bong, bong, bong. No. Have you ever seen the little bells on the little counters where if you need assistance, ring the bell? This is what the clock strikes like. And I wish I could have, Hank, I really wish I could have had some audio on this, but I recently did tape it, and it sounds like pling, 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 and that's it. So this great big clock with this squeaky little chime. But Peggy, while she was listening to these chimes, as we mentioned, she married Henry in 1849, and they take in a child named John Bell. Any descendant of the Bells here today? Because they quite often do come to my presentations. It doesn't look like we have one today, but John Bell was about 4 years old. He was 4 or 5 in the 1850 census, and he was a surprise to me. I didn't know anything about this other child that was in the house the whole time. So when I was writing the book, I get this information. Now I have to write in another character. And John Bell actually does become a very, very important character in the book. Peggy does start to have children of her own. Peggy gives birth to Mary in 1851. Mary is very important because she is the one person who lived long enough to tell these stories to someone that I can speak to. So I spoke to Mary's great-granddaughter, who actually remembered sitting at her great-grandmother's feet and getting stories about the Civil War. The main thing that came through was they were afraid all the time. She said they were just lived in fear. Peggy gives birth to David in 1853, and Susanna in 1855. Like clockwork, Rebecca in 1857, And then the story takes a real tragic turn. David dies in 1859. Peggy is pregnant with the next child when David dies. And in the book, I have her actually going into labor on the way home from the funeral. I don't know that that really happened. However, we do know that she gave birth to Priscilla 2 days after David died. And we know that the custom was to have the funeral 1 day after death. So it does seem likely that she would have been pretty close to giving birth if she did in fact attend that funeral. And the funeral would have been at Weaver's Church. Back to my map. I love my maps. Weaver's Church is highlighted there toward the top right. And this would have been a very central part of their lives, west of Harrisonburg. At the time of marriage, most Mennonites in those days would have joined the church, either right before they got married or right after they got married. So Henry and Peggy, we do know, both joined Weaver's Mennonite Church. And if you know the church today, it's on the other side of the road. That's not a mistake on this map. At the time of the Civil War, Weaver's Church was on the north side of the road. And when you read the author's introduction to the book, you'll know why that was really important. But I'll just throw it out there in case anyone is familiar enough with Rockingham County that no, Weaver's Church was on the north side of the road. They lived about a mile from the church. So the Civil War intervened. Not quite yet, but there was talk of secession. And most of the Mennonites were opposed to secession. And we do have this statement from Peggy. For tonight's presentation, I tried to use as many of Peggy's actual words as I could. And I do think this is in the book as well. Where I could in the book, I used Peggy's actual words. This is testimony before the Southern Claims Commission. And the Southern Claims Commission came down and interviewed people who claimed to be loyal to the Union throughout the war. And if you gave up property or had property taken by the Union Army, you could be reimbursed for that property. And so Peggy, 10 years after the war, is still trying to get reimbursed. And she says, you know, I sympathized altogether with the Union, the same as my husband. We were both members of the Mennonite Church and did not believe in slavery, which is true, and had no sympathy with the war. In other words, they were completely opposed. I did not believe in secession, nor did my husband. I am very certain that he did not vote for it. And in fact, he did not vote. However, he didn't vote at all because Peggy's husband was very sick. He was dying of tuberculosis. And more than likely was not going to go to town and vote. But there was a lot of intimidation involved in that secession vote. And almost everyone who would have voted against secession either voted for it or not at all. So the actual vote was 3,000 to 22 in Rockingham County. So there were 22 that dared to vote against secession. So the war begins, but the Mennonites and most people in the valley thought that the war would be very brief. They thought that the Union Army would be more organized and better staffed, better trained, and this would be a few little skirmishes, and that would be that. And really before the first battle, the first large battle occurs at Weaver's Church, and this is an image that you're seeing now of Weaver's Church, not nearly as nice as this church, which was built in, I believe, 1855. So this church would have been around at the time of the Civil War, but this Mennonite church, which was built in the 1820s, would have been really just a log structure. But Peggy's bishop Bishop Sam Kaufman was delivering a sermon on June 23rd, 1861, and two Confederate soldiers came into the sanctuary and waited until the sermon was over, and then they announced that in 1 week, all of the young men in the church, and everyone else really, young men in the valley, needed to report for duty. So this was, again, June 23rd, 1861, and they were to report for duty by July 1. After the church service was over, the church council got together and they decided that they would allow the young men to go off to the training camp, which was at Winchester at that time. But they had to pledge to the bishop and to their mothers, if their mothers were living, that they would not kill anyone and they would not hurt anyone because they were non-resistant. They didn't believe in taking up arms. This didn't work very well. They pretty much stuck to their pledges, and they went off and were in some battles like the First Battle of Manassas. And, they were kind of targets. They didn't defend themselves, and they weren't killed, but they were not very good soldiers. So Stonewall Jackson was smart enough to recognize this, and he also was smart enough to know that the farms needed to be tended. So when we get past the First Battle of Manassas, we get out into the fall, and especially the late fall, he actually furloughed a lot of men, not just Mennonites and Dunkers, but many men to come home and put the seeds in for the winter crops. And this gentleman is my great-great-grandfather, Manassas Heatwold. It's a coincidence that his first name is Manassas, and he was at the First Battle of Manassas. And we assume that he did not kill anybody, but he came home and with this group of Mennonites. And it was decided at that point that they were not going to go back. So then came the period of hiding, is the quote. And that quote actually is from another great-grandfather of mine who wrote a book called Reminiscences of the Civil War. So the decision was made. They're not going to go back. So what are we going to do? Well, there were too many of them to just hide in the valley. So they started working on an underground railroad. And this is where Peggy comes back into the story in a big way. So the bishop, who was Peggy's neighbor, by the way, the bishop and the church council decided that they were not going to go back because they did have this underground railroad now in place, and that there was a third option, which was to really take off through the mountains and go either north or west and just get out of the Confederacy, get away from the war. So the rules changed a little bit at this point, and the church said, you can't go back. If you go back, you will be excommunicated from the church, which was a big deal because the church was so central to their existence. So this is what Peggy said about all of this. This is her testimony before the Southern Claims Commission. And she said very strongly, I was not only willing, but I did aid persons to escape from the Confederacy. Many times they came and stayed at our place 5 or 6 together at a time and would stay sometimes several days waiting for the guides to take them through the mountains. Now keep in mind, Peggy's husband is dying of tuberculosis. She's living on a heavily mortgaged 120-acre farm with no children that are old enough to help do anything, really. She is also hiding 5 or 6 men at a time in a secret cellar underneath the house. So Peggy was very busy for a while there. And the announcement came from the governor, Governor Letcher of Virginia, that the militia would be called back. And it didn't matter if you had an exemption for medical purposes. It didn't matter who you were. You had to report to the courthouse in Rockingham County on March the 14th. So on March the 13th, the night of March the 13th, they head for the hills, and the Underground Railroad was in business, but it did not go well. The most frequent destination on the Underground Railroad was New Creek, which today is what we would call Kaiser, West Virginia. New Creek Station was a station on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So if you could get to New Creek, you could go west to Ohio or Illinois, or you could go back east into Pennsylvania, where you might have some family and friends that could help you. And I, of course, had to have a map of this. And the red dot that you see is us. That's Edinburgh, the big red dot. And at the bottom of the map, you'll see Harrisonburg, just a little bit west of Harrisonburg. So I started the red line at Peggy's Depot, and it goes back through Hopkins Gap. They used multiple gaps, but in this case, it was Hopkins Gap. Back behind Little North Mountain, and then west through, at the time it was called Dovesville, it is now called Bergton. And then back across the Shenandoah and across the South Fork Mountain to Petersburg. And one of the groups was actually captured in Petersburg, but they had intended to go twice that far. So they were trying to get to New Creek Station. Now Peggy, this is dangerous. Hiding people in the cellar under your house that are draft dodgers and worse yet, deserters is dangerous business. It can land you in Castle Thunder in Richmond as a political prisoner. Peggy was not ever caught, but she did have another job that was probably more dangerous. So in addition to taking care of these small children, 5 small children by then, because she continued to have children, she was taking care of the farm, she was taking care of her dying husband, she was hiding 5 or 6 refugees at a time in the basement, and she was delivering the mail. So Peggy was considered a postmaster. She used the masculine term, postmaster, on the Underground Railroad. So she would deliver mail up to 6 miles to friends and family of the refugees who actually did escape, and then she would pick up letters from them and give those to the pilots who would take them through the mountains to the refugees. Of course, this is a very slow process, but it's also a very dangerous process, because if you get caught carrying letters across enemy lines, the assumption is going to be that you're giving away information to the enemy and that you're basically a spy. So this was actually more dangerous than any concealing of refugees. And then, of course, poor Peggy's husband. This is what Peggy actually said about her husband in her testimony. My husband was an invalid and not troubled with the military much. This meant that this is a good place for a depot for hiding deserters and draft dodgers, because he was in such poor health that they're not going to come looking for him. And they had no children that were old enough to be drafted, so a good hiding place. He was not troubled with the military much. My husband died in July, this would be July of 1864, and left a will. I really like this part. He left a will drawn up but not executed, so he didn't sign it, in which he gave me all his property as long as I remained a widow, and raised his children decently and orderly and gave them a reasonable education. So we talk about Peggy's farm, but it was really never Peggy's farm, because in those days, women generally didn't own property. Peggy had dower rights to the farm. And it's interesting to me that it was as long as she remained a widow. That's how dower rights work. So Peggy gets married again. And after the war, and I won't give away too much in the book in terms of all of the adventures that Peggy has in hiding these people, but after the war, she does remarry and gives up her right to the farm. She just turns it over to the children, and she married one of the refugees. He was not one of the refugees that stayed in her secret cellar. Otherwise, we would have kind of a Amish romance kind of thing going on here. But Peggy did marry one of the Mennonite refugees and moved to a different farm, and her children inherited the farm. And my favorite detail, oh, well, before we get to that, Peggy had her admirers, modern day admirers. In the 6-volume set called Unionists and the Civil War Experience in the Shenandoah Valley, it's available at the Edinburgh Mill. It's a great resource. I don't know if you have ever seen it there. If you stack 6 volumes on top of each other, it's this high. And this is where a lot of this testimony, this verbatim testimony, comes from. And the editors and compilers of this 6-volume set had this to say about Peggy. They said, Mrs. Rhodes was in many ways a remarkable woman. Not only intelligent, she was courageous enough to stand with her husband for their religious and political principles. She did not hesitate to take what risks were necessary. The compilers of this 6-volume set did not editorialize very much. They didn't really express their opinion one way or the other about the people. But this is one of the few places where they said, wow, this is a remarkable person. And that got my attention. Not just because she's my ancestor, but because she truly was a remarkable person. Now, my favorite detail about Peggy is that she's not smiling in this photograph. And this is a model that's portraying Peggy, and we intentionally told her, don't smile, because there's really nothing to smile about in this story. It's a pretty sad story. But the other reason is Peggy had really bad teeth, and which was not uncommon at the time. And we actually have a letter between her children where they say, Mom got her false teeth, and they don't fit very well. So Peggy had, for the last few years of her life, she had oversized dentures. I'm not sure what dentures would have been like back then, but I'm pretty sure she was not smiling about any of this. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavor of the book and my experience writing it. As I mentioned, a lot of the wording here is her actual testimony, what she said. So I would be happy to take some questions if you have them about Peggy or Mennonites or the Civil War in the Valley. Be happy to answer any questions that you have. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the Brethren Heritage Center.
Yes.
Where is that?
It's the Brethren and Mennonite Heritage Center, and that is 2.5 miles west of Harrisonburg, straight west. And it's near Harrisonburg High School, very near Harrisonburg High School. And Peggy's grandfather, his cobbler shop is there. He lived in it while he was waiting for his wife and family to come down from Pennsylvania. That's why I say it was his. But yes, it's a great place to visit.
It's on Garber's Church Road.
Yes, Garber's Church Road. Yes, sir.
What reparations was she ever by the United States government?
That's a good question. The first time she applied, which was in 1871, she was turned down. She did not receive anything. And they took everything that she had in terms of the crops in her barn and her livestock. She was left with one cow. She begged for one cow that she got to keep. And she was turned down in 1871. She reapplied in 1875 and was given half payment. So it was, I believe it was $500 $521 and some cents.
Did she suffer from the burning and all?
My wife has given me strict instructions not to give away too much about that, but she was, I will say this, she was 2 miles from ground zero when Lieutenant Meigs was killed, and the order went out to burn everything within a 5-mile radius. She lived 2 miles from where that incident occurred. So it does come up quite importantly in the book. It's the climax of the book. Yes. Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you. Considering the proximity to what became the West Virginia state line, did she make any note, did anything change about the operation of the Underground Railway or did West Virginia actually not become West Virginia yet in 1863 or 64 there?
It's a great question. In 1863, in the spring of 1863, West Virginia voted to secede from Virginia and became West Virginia. And then the Union, it took them a little while to recognize this because they didn't want to admit that you could secede from anything. So, but Abraham Lincoln decided that West Virginia would be readmitted to the Union. So that occurred certainly by the middle of 1863. This did have an impact. The first county over on the other side of the Shenandoah Mountain is Pendleton County, and then the county above that would have been Hardy County. And these were heavily contested areas where the local sentiment was about evenly split, probably leaning more Confederate than anything else. So initially, it didn't have a huge impact, but eventually the home guard in those counties, especially Pendleton County, they called themselves the Swamp Dragons, and there's a chapter in the book called Swamp Dragons. The Swamp Dragons actually did help refugees go through to New Creek Station. So by 1864, the Underground Railroad was much more successful than it was in 1862. It was a disaster in 1862, but 1863, it started to get a little easier, and then 1864, I don't think anyone was actually caught. They all made it through in 1864. So yes. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Peggy had a little help at her house?
She did. I exaggerated slightly, and my wife is calling me on it. Peggy, Henry's mother, Peggy's mother-in-law, would watch the children while all of this was going on. And that's a big job. There were 5 children at one point. Of course, we had the one child died, but she's continuing to have children. I didn't list all of the children, including my own great-grandfather, who was born in 1861. So she had a child every 2 years. And her mother-in-law helped quite a bit with the children, although the mother-in-law was getting up in years. And also, I should mention, too, that John Bell, who starts out as maybe a 10-year-old boy in the book, does a lot to run the farm. So you have this pre-teen really running the whole operation in terms of the field work. I don't think Peggy did a lot of field work. So yes, she did have some help. And I think her father was still living, and she had 2 brothers, and I think her sister would have helped her as well. Yes, sir?
Do you have an approximate number of young men that would have come back from the war and then gone into hiding from the valley?
This is where you need to read that 6-volume set by Norman Wanger and David Rhodes, who's distantly related to me, but I should say the late David Rhodes. They say thousands. So this started out as friends and family, and it went way beyond that. There were about 500 Mennonite families in the valley at the time, and thousands of refugees went through this Underground Railroad. Peggy says in her testimony, she did not know most of the men that were hiding under the house. So again, this is a dangerous thing. They might be a double agent, and that was attempted as a ruse. I want to desert, can you help me? But it's actually a conscription scout that is asking for the help. So she didn't know the vast majority of men that she protected in her secret cellar. So yeah, I wouldn't sleep really well with 5 or 6 guys under my bed that I don't know. So thousands. Yes, sir.
The tall clock being, you said, the only artifact that you have from Peggy's house.
Yes.
Is that I assume most tall clocks are famous makers. Do you know the maker of that clock?
Yes, the maker, and I'm going to do a bad thing here and go back to that. The maker is a Harrisonburg clockmaker. I can't quite read it. I should know it off the top of my head, but Hennessy, I believe, Peter Hennessy? Henneberger. 1820s, so that clock is more than, right around 200 years old. It would have been older than Peggy or Henry. And unfortunately, it was in great shape until it was in a fire in 1994. It was still on the same farm in a house that was built in the 1890s. And in 1994, there was a pretty severe house fire, and the clock was damaged and was repaired by descendants of, what's the name again? Henneberger? Yeah, his descendants actually restored the clock for the family. It's in the home of Pete Burkholder, who would be my third cousin. He would be also Peggy's great-great-grandson. And I was just thrilled to actually see it and hear it. And it's the only thing I could think of that would be close to the exact same sound that they heard. These are great questions. Yes, ma'am?
Did she help any slaves?
Yes, I do get that question sometimes. There was a tiny bit of overlap between this Underground Railroad and the Underground Railroad for fugitive slaves. But the routes didn't overlap very much. There is one example in the book where a group of refugees are going through the mountains and they are joined by 3 black men, and the assumption is that they were escaped slaves. And in my telling of the historical fiction, I do make that assumption, and I say that they were the slaves owned by the widow that they had visited that day. And she warned them, we do know that she warned them, don't tell my slaves what you're doing or they'll run off. And then it doesn't say this in the historical narrative, but in the very next scene, if you will, these black men are with them. So they did run off with them. So that's the only example I could find in that big 6 volumes where it really overlapped directly. Yes, sir, in the back.
No.
Oh, yes, ma'am, in the back.
That's okay. Out of the thousands that utilized the railroad, were they all men, or did women and their children accompany them? And how difficult would that have been?
It's almost all men in terms of hiding in the depots. Peggy did not assist any women. However, there are examples of entire families on their own going back through the mountains. The Abraham Good family is one. John Bell's brother was with that family. The Bell family was split up. And John Bell's brother, James, was with that family. And James, we know, never made it all the way to Ohio. He stopped and became a swamp dragon. So these families, didn't always agree on everything about the Civil War. But yes, there are some examples of women on their own going north, and also families going through the mountains. And then, of course, after the burning, you had lots of families going north with Sheridan. So, but I don't think Peggy actually assisted any women. She does not mention any. These are really good questions. Any more?
Were the swamp dragons Confederate or Union?
The swamp dragons were protectors of Unionist people in Pendleton County. But I'm being a little bit generous when I say protectors. I mean, they would have called themselves a home guard, but they were always accused of all kinds of other things, as were McNeil's Rangers and other home guard units. It wasn't all good. You know, it got pretty nasty. Yes, Barbara.
When the men returned, was there resentment from the families who had stayed here and fought and died in the surrender?
Yes, and this is, I think, the best question of all. The reason why this story was untold for so long, the question was there resentment after the war? And this is why this story really stayed buried for a long time. My parents knew nothing about it. My grandparents knew nothing about it because their parents didn't dare talk about this. You needed to get along with your neighbor because your neighbor is going to help you bring the crops in. You need to work with your neighbor, and you don't sit down with your neighbor and talk about how you were a Union loyalist during the Civil War. So I think the story was almost lost if it hadn't been for some historians. Samuel Horst was one, and then of course the compilers of that 6-volume set, Norman Wanger and David Rhodes. If it hadn't been for them, I think this story would completely be gone. People didn't talk about it for good reason.
Thanks to you for digging in and bringing it to us.
Well, it wasn't just me. There were a lot of historians that went way before me that I just tried to make it more readable. I think I saw one more hand in the back. Yes, ma'am?
I was wondering, I read parts of the book, and I was wondering, as the men were being led over the mountains to Petersburg or wherever, were there trails that they were following, or were they just going through the brush?
Historians have differed on this. I think the first group that went back, that was captured on March 15th, had to have gone by the main roads, and that's the route that I drew up on that map, because they left at midnight on 10 o'clock on March 13th, and they arrived in at the South Fork on the other side of the Shenandoah Mountain. They arrived there the next afternoon. So it really took about 20 hours for them to do that. It's 35 miles. So you cannot 70 men and 30 plus horses just can't crash through the woods at night and make that kind of progress. They had to have stuck to the roads. And that's probably one reason they were captured. I think later on, they became smarter and used more obscure trails. But I doubt, if they had horses, I doubt seriously that they just went straight up over ridges. I think they would have had at least a trail. Anyone else? Well, thank you all very much. This has been a pleasure.